Kids Radio, it's Trina Murray here, and on the line we've got Linda Hynes, who is a partner at the employment law firm Lewis Silkin. Linda, you're very welcome.
Lovely to be on, Trina. Thanks for having me.
Working in cold weather. So this is something that you wouldn't think that this would be an issue for employers, but it can be. So with all the storms lately, and we keep hearing about more storms coming, where do employees and employers stand?
Well, I suppose the first thing for employers to think about is actually having some kind of policy in place. As we know, these weather warnings and the advice not to take unnecessary journeys seems to be a constant in our lives. So it would be a good idea for employers to try and plan for what are they going to do when those situations arise. So we'd always recommend having some kind of policy in place, or at least letting employees know how the employer is going to deal with that situation. But there's a few things to think about. So the first thing would be in terms of people actually being in the workplace and what your requirements are there as an employer. And I think we've all been in an office where there's a dispute about how warm or how cold it should be and what temperature the air conditioning should be at.
I'm just laughing because my colleague Jeremy literally just walked into the studio 20 seconds ago to change the air conditioning because I was freezing in here. So
it's a constant. Yeah, and you'll always have people who find it too warm and find it too cold. It's kind of the typical office conflict, isn't it?
I'm going to faint in probably 20 minutes when this heats up, but yeah, I know exactly, yeah.
Well, that's the thing. We're not very patient with air conditioning systems, so people will pump them right up to 25 degrees, then everybody is too warm and they go right down to 18 degrees. But in terms of the employer's obligations, they do need to carry out an assessment in the workplace, and that would include lots of health and safety matters, but also what's the kind of appropriate temperature for the room. We do have some health and safety legislation around it, and the minimum temperature for sedentary office work or for other office work that doesn't involve serious physical effort, a minimum temperature of 16 degrees is what's recommended. Now, we don't have, as you do in some other countries, we don't have a situation where an employee can say it's illegal for me to work in this cold room, but they could raise health and safety issues around the room and what the employer is obliged to do.
And do people really get onto their employer about things like that, about the temperature? I wouldn't have thought that was such a big issue. I would have thought you might be a bit cold, put on a cardigan or something.
Well, I mean, I suppose if it's a constant issue, people might, or if it's a particularly cold day where they're finding it difficult to actually work or concentrate, they might. You also have that situation where these minor conflicts can arise between employees about the temperature of the room and actually lead to kind of disputes between the employees themselves. So you want to try and avoid those. So there's the employee relation side of it, and then also the health and safety side of it.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other big thing would be, if you get travel warnings and employees saying they're not able to come to work. I think for office work these days, that might be less of an issue where people are able to work from home and work remotely. So there might not be that same level of disruption. But for other workplaces, that's something that an employer should put a policy in for, because, employees should be letting employers know if they can't come to work and trying to make other arrangements. But generally, there's no legal obligation to pay employees for snow days where they haven't made it to work.
Oh, okay.
It's a different situation if you as the employer have to close the workplace. Then usually you'll still have to pay the employee.
God, I remember a few years ago, do you remember that snow that we had where you couldn't get a loaf of bread anywhere? And so that was before COVID, and we just weren't used to this whole working from home thing. Oh my God, trudging into work in the snow. I think it took me about 2 hours to get here. But there's so many things to think of. Also,
I know, I remember buying those things to put on your shoes.
Yeah.
So that you had grips in the frozen snow.
I was so delighted with myself when I managed to source a Brennan's bread. I was like, look at me. I put it on social media. So Linda Hynes there from the employment law firm Lewis Silkin. We're going to chat more with her after 1. It's Ireland's Classic Kids Radio. Classic Kids Radio, it's Trina Murray here. Linda Hynes is with us. She is from the employment law firm Lewis Silkin, and we're talking today about weather warnings, about bad weather out generally, and how your employer should really have a policy in place when it comes to whether you can come into work on those particular days, but also to do with things like the temperature of your office. And even when you think of women who might be going through menopause in their offices, and the heat can really affect them, if you're in an office that's too hot, there needs to be a policy there as well to look after women going through menopause.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of employers take those issues into account now as part of their health and safety risk assessments, whereas maybe traditionally they didn't. There's a lot more awareness now around menopause and the issues that it can create for employees. You know, even being able to be in an office where you can open a window maybe, or being able to move to a slightly cooler location, those types of solutions can help. And even just, I think, you know, from the employee relations perspective, employers being aware that these are possible issues for employees and letting employees know they care and they're keeping these issues in mind, and that if there is any problems to please speak to someone rather than people being miserable at their workstations.
Yeah. I always feel sorry for people who work outdoors, you know, when it's particularly bad weather. You're like, how do they continue? I guess it's kind of part of the job. So just a question for you about schools, because schools often close when there's bad weather. The pipes are frozen, as we used to hear in the 1980s. And obviously this is a massive knock-on effect for working parents. And I know even the voting, a lot of schools are being used as polling stations now, coming up on March 8th as well. And we're hearing that the schools are going to be closed. Where do parents stand when they've no option, when the schools are closing because of weather or circumstances like that?
Well, it's tricky for parents because, you know, technically the employer isn't obliged to pay them for those days that they're not attending work. But I think there just needs to be some discussion between employers and their staff as to how those days are going to be treated. We do have a lot more options now in terms of the types of leave people can take, and also people possibly being able to work from home. So there's probably a lot more solutions to that now than maybe we had 5 years ago, because COVID has so completely changed the way people work now. But I think communication is key, and making it clear to employees how those situations can be facilitated. You know, some employees may take annual leave on those days, or may say, I'll have to work a few less hours today from home because of that. You know, allowing people maybe to work up the hours on a different day, or take some kind of unpaid or annual leave. They're all options.
So I guess when it's a bad weather and on the morning it's very short notice, I guess, but when it's something like that, like your school being used for a polling station, which, by the way, check your emails in case it is. It's kind of planning now, isn't it, for the 8th of March, really, in advance. Okay, well, that's great. Employment law expert Linda Hynes, who is from Lewis Silkin. Hopefully we'll speak to you again with some tips there for employers and for employees if you're concerned about, you know, these storms or the bad weather we've been having and how it affects your work. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Trina.